All right, so now we're going to go into a section called Lifelines. And if we go back to the Garden of Eden in Genesis, we will find that when God created man, he created us for fellowship with him and to take dominion. Those were the two things that we were tasked to do back in the garden. But we all know that some tragic things happened, bad things happened, and we find ourselves here today. So, but with that, that need for fellowship, God has placed in us a need, not a want, not a desire. It is a need to be loved, to be known, to know that we have that we matter and that we have value, that we need to be loved and accepted. But unfortunately, because we are no longer in the garden and we walk around with these broken mindsets, then unfortunately what we do is we try and get those needs met by other people. We plug our lifelines into other people because we have to get that need met. We do. And when we are dealing with other people who have broken mindsets, how in the world are we going to be able to get a true perspective? How in the world are we going to need to get the need to be loved met by somebody who was never meant to fulfill that role? You see, Adam was created and then Eve was created to be his helper. They were never meant to be God to each other and to be the one that fed each other life-giving properties. It was only by God, by walking in fellowship with God and meeting with him daily in the garden. That is where we are called to be. But when we plug our lifelines into other people, then this is what happens. We get shattered, because what happens when somebody with an improper mindset who they're dealing with brokenness themselves, how in the world can they even begin to meet a need that we have in the wholeness and truth? They can't. They absolutely can't. It was meant to be given by God and God alone. And what happens when they decide to leave? Then they cut that lifeline off, and now we no longer have any kind of life-giving hope coming. And the truth of the matter is that when we plug our lifeline into the wrong people, oftentimes we get a whole lot of junk that comes through that lifeline. And I say it all the time, is that we will choke down volumes of poison for one glimpse of hope and promise. But what does that do? That leaves residue all over us that we were never, ever meant to take and to carry. And what happens? We get filled. We get filled just waiting for that one promise that, God, do I matter? Tell that person to make me feel like I matter. When God's saying, I'm telling you, all you have to do is look up. Just look up. You stop looking to other people. Because I'm going to tell you a secret here, is that people will let you down. Did you know that? You will be disappointed by people. They will leave you, they will hurt you, and they will let you down. But you know who will never let you down? You know who will never leave you nor forsake you? The one who will always love you and speak hope and promise and life into you? God. And that is where our lifeline needs to be plugged in. Always, always. All right. So now, normally you would have a book with you and you could follow along in the story. But if you don't mind, I'm just going to have a little story time with you so you can sit back and just enjoy the story. But I'm going to ask you to let this be your journey, to allow God to speak to you
And let this be you. Just imagine yourself as this young girl. And I'll just tell you the backstory of what is happening is her name is Josephine Smith, the character of this story that you are going to meet in a moment. And she has befriended this man named Mr. John, who is Jesus, spoiler alert. But he takes her to his father's adventure park. And so this is the first adventure that they come into. And so this is an example of what the arrows do to us. This is a visual representation of all of us walking around with arrows stuck into us. So, all right, so just enjoy. Okay. I closed my eyes, pushed the door open, and took a step inside. The door shut behind me, and I found myself standing in a huge open hall that was poorly lit and completely empty, except for something or someone standing at the opposite end of the room. This was not at all what I had imagined or expected. I squinted hard in order to see who or what was at the end of the hall. It appeared to be a person, so I called out to see if he or she could direct me to where I was supposed to go. There was no response, so I began walking toward the figure to see what it was. The hall was strangely quiet, and as I started walking, each of my footsteps boomed on the stone floor, then echoed resoundingly off of the walls. Soon, it became a comforting melody that replaced the eerie silence of the room. As I got closer, I could see that it was indeed a person, or at least something like a person. I finally found myself standing face to face with myself. Was this supposed to be a joke? I was confronted with a perfect likeness of Josephine Ann Smith. The only difference between my real-life body and the lifeless one in front of me was that it had hundreds of arrows sticking into it, covering it almost entirely. There were clusters of arrows in the heart area and in the head, but the arrows were everywhere. They seemed to be ordinary arrows, although I noticed that some of the tips were different from the others. Many were what I would consider regular arrowheads, similar to pictures I had seen in stories about Native Americans. Others looked charred and burnt as if they had been on fire at some point. The area around where the arrow had pierced the skin was charred and burnt as well. The third type of arrow was very different from the other two. This particular type of arrow puzzled me for a minute. The part of the arrowhead that was still visible was coated with some sort of thick green liquid that discolored every part of the arrow it touched. On the skin of the Josephine-like image was the same green discoloration. It wasn't just on the surface of the skin, it also went deep down beneath the skin in trails that vanished far below the surface. I bent down to examine it further and recoiled back at the toxic odor that it emitted. I guessed that it was some sort of poison, and I definitely didn't want to mess with those arrows. Just to the right of the body was a small placard that read, "The key to move forward you will only find when you learn to leave your past behind." What key, I wondered. I shrugged my shoulders, not knowing what this riddle meant, and then I turned my attention back to the body. I studied her for a few minutes, wondering what all this meant and what I was supposed to do. As I looked over this horrific scene in front of me, my focus stopped abruptly when I gazed into her eyes. They were not the eyes of a doll or a stuffed animal. They actually seemed to be alive. Not only did there seem to be life, but there was something else deep within them which kept me staring, wanting to know what it was. I took a step forward to get a better look, trying to make sense of what was going on. A small cry escaped from my mouth when I finally understood what I was looking at. It was pain that I saw in her eyes. That pain was the exact same pain that I felt deep within me, and I tried so very hard to hide. Staring at her and knowing exactly what she was feeling made the hurt inside of me burn so fiercely that I thought I might die. I bit my lip in an attempt to keep back the tears that were welling up. I wanted to look the other way. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't turn my eyes away from the pain in hers. As if in a dream, I felt myself reaching up to touch the eyes of the girl who bore my resemblance. As I did so, my hand brushed the end of an arrow, to which I immediately looked down. I'd been so focused on her eyes that I'd completely forgotten about the arrows. I was so close to them now, the smell was nauseating, and I could see the countless trails of poison deep beneath the surface of the skin, as well as the charred flesh where the flaming arrows had gone in. What kind of sick and cruel person would do such a thing? I was beginning to regret coming to this place, and a surge of fear was growing inside of me. Taking in the whole scene and feeling utterly helpless to do anything for this girl that stood before me, I became overwhelmed and started to panic. I didn't know what to do. I was furious at whoever would display such a gruesome image, and then to have her look just like me was more than I could bear. As if a switch had been flipped on inside of me, my fright instantly became anger, and my jaws became firm and tightly clenched. My face told the story of the anger within me, and I was determined to free this poor girl in front of me. Then, after she was free, I would leave this awful place. I grabbed a hold of an arrow, intending to pull it out of her body, but as soon as I touched it, the most extraordinary thing happened. "Maybe someday you'll be good enough," a man called out as soon as my fingers touched the arrow shaft. The voice seemed to be familiar and sounded like a school teacher I once had. "Hello? Is anyone there?" I asked as I dropped my hand back to my side and turned to see who was speaking to me. No one was there. I was still completely alone. Again, I reached for another arrow, and just as my fingers touched it, I heard, "You're not smart enough to be in our group." This time I knew instantly who said it and the exact moment it had been thrown at me. In my fright, my hand tightened around the arrow, and as I turned to see if she was with me, the arrow came out too. "Trisha, is that you? Hello?" I called out again. Once more, silence was the only response. I turned back to the likeness of myself and couldn't believe what I saw. There in the place of where the tip had pierced the skin was the word "brilliant." The word completely covered over where the wound had been created by the arrow. I grabbed another arrow and heard my dad yelling at me. "What's the matter with you? Can't you do anything right?" Then another, "You bozo, why are you so stupid?" In a rush of determination, I began furiously pulling out every arrow that plagued this poor creature. In the flurry of touching the arrows, the voices filled the room as I heard each one called out, "I hate you. You don't have what it takes. Maybe someday you'll be pretty. It's all your fault. What kind of person would do something like that? You aren't skinny enough." On and on, the scenes of the murderous words replayed before me until I couldn't bear it anymore. With the loudest scream I could manage, I tried to drown out the words that were playing over and over on an old tape recorder stuck inside of my head. The words were not going away, and the more I screamed, the louder they became. Tormented, I put my hands over my ears and violently shook my head again, trying to get rid of the voices that sounded in my mind. In a blinding rage, I began ripping arrow after arrow out as fast as I could, trying not to feel the blows from all the awful words that had hurt me so deeply throughout my life. It wasn't until I grabbed the very first arrow once again that I stopped to pay attention to what was actually happening. "Maybe someday you'll be good enough," my teacher's voice repeated. The impact of the words hit me once again, forcing the wound to go deeper within her body. I never wanted to hear those words again, and in my determination, I took the arrow firmly in my hand and yanked it as hard as I could. Amazed, I watched as I saw the words "fully equipped" emerge to cover over the side of the wound. Once the words appeared, there was no longer any evidence of the original brutality. Its place remembered it no longer. I looked back to the places where I had just removed all those other horrible arrows and saw words of life and encouragement that hadn't been there before. Frantically, I began pulling out the rest, reliving the events all over again, as well as the pain of each and every stinging word that had and still hurt me. I reached out to grab a poison-tipped arrow from Josephine's heart, my heart, and stopped cold when I heard the curse that went with it. You are nothing special, and you'll never amount to anything. As I heard these words again, the pain cut me just as deeply as on the day they had been spoken to me. The voice of the archer was very familiar to me, and I recognized it at once. It was the voice of someone I had loved and admired, and she was supposed to have loved me too. The memory of that moment seemed so real that if I closed my eyes, I could see her standing right in front of me, pouring those words over me again. Still weeping, I opened my eyes to look at where the arrow had punctured me, and the mortal wound began to bleed afresh. As I watched the blood run down the front of my body, I began sobbing. The bleeding brought back every painful moment of that encounter. I pulled and pulled on it, trying to remove the arrow, but the arrowhead and its poison only went deeper into my heart. My pain was unbearable. Exhausted, I sank hopelessly to the ground. I was helpless to do anything but sit there and sob because I didn't have the strength to pull the arrow out. This arrowhead was buried far too deep beneath the skin surface and would not come out as easily as the others had done. I sat there. As I sat there, the words continued to haunt me, beating me further into the ground. Finally, out of sheer desperation, I screamed out as loud as I could, "I can't do this anymore. This hurts too badly. I can't make it stop. I need help, please. Won't someone help me?" Crying uncontrollably, I put my head down and desperately wished that I was anywhere but here. I didn't hear him come in, but when I finally looked up, I saw Mr. John standing in front of me. I don't know how long he had been there, but I was relieved that he was there and grateful that I was no longer alone. Too exhausted from pulling out the arrows and reliving every awful memory that went with each one, I didn't even have the strength to stand up and seek refuge and comfort in his open arms. Helplessly, I just looked up at him with pleading eyes and a tear-streaked face. Mr. John bent down and gently lifted me to my feet. He tenderly rocked me in his arms for what seemed an eternity and sang a soft and soothing song over me that stirred something within. As I listened intently to every word he sang, I found that my tears had completely stopped. He sang, "Peace be still, my little one. Love and healing have now begun. I chose you first from long ago. Those who are mine, I'll never let go. Find your strength and rest in me, my precious one, your royalty." I began to feel safe and peace here with my friend. In fact, I had never felt so loved or protected before in all my life. I never wanted to leave those loving arms and face the cruel, heartless world again. "It's all right, child. I'm here to help you," he whispered over me. "Joe, reach out your hand and grab the arrow again. This time, we will pull together." With all the strength I could muster, I put my hand on the arrow and let out a heavy sigh. As I began to pull, I noticed that Mr. John's hand was on top of mine. Unlike when I tried on my own, this time the arrow came out so easily that I didn't even realize it was out until I saw the word royalty take its place. Rubbing my fingers over the previously infected flesh, I looked closer and saw that all of the poison had been drawn out along with the arrow. Nothing remained of the damage it had done to me. With renewed strength, Mr. John and I removed every arrow until all that remained on her body were words of life. All of the arrows lay in a heaping pile at my feet, no longer able to wield their destructive and deadly blows. I didn't really know what to do next. Should I run away or get angry at having to go through such a horrid experience? Perhaps I should thank Mr. John for his help and then scold him for taking so long to help me. I didn't know what else to do, so I just stood there in front of the freed and healed Josephine Ann Smith and began celebrating with her for her newfound freedom. The pain in her eyes was gone. And upon that realization, I stepped back, put my hands upon my own heart. Could it be that my pain was gone too? I looked up at Mr. John in amazement. With excited laughter, I said, "It's not there anymore. The hurt in my heart, it isn't there. You took it out." All at once, I started jumping up and down, screaming with joy. For the first time in a long time, I could actually breathe without feeling the sting from the pain that had lived inside of me for so many years. With arms open wide, I started twirling around in circles until I fell down from dizziness. When I hit the ground, I started to laugh like never before. I laughed for so long that my face and chest began to hurt. I didn't mind, though. I was free, and my inner pain was gone. Mr. John joined me in my marvelous celebration, and he, too, began to laugh, the laugh of joy. How I had ever been able to live with all of that hurt, I'll never know. But right now, I wasn't about to figure it out. Finally regaining my composure, Mr. John helped me to my feet and gave me a big hug. Looking back over my body, I read all the words that it so proudly displayed now. And then I turned to Mr. John and asked, "Mr. John, what do all these words mean? Please tell me what just happened." "My dear Joe, these words that you see are the words that describe who you really are. You were never meant to receive those curses that hurt you so. You have been made special and wonderful. There is no one else like you, nor will there ever be. Don't you see that you are amazing and that you never have to compare yourself to anyone else or try to measure up to another individual? You have your own path that you must walk in life, and what has been given to someone else will not be what you need for your journey. I promise you that if you allow my Father and me to help you, you will never be unprepared or average ever again." The words Mr. John spoke seemed to soothe my very soul, and I needed to hear more. You have more power than you realize, Joe. Average was never supposed to be a word used to describe you. In fact, there is nothing average about you. You still have many things to learn, but just as a baby bird must learn how to fly, you too must learn the basics. But one day, you will soar with the wings of eagles. You will do great things with my help. Now you have the ability to heal others whose hearts are hurting just like yours did for so long. You will no longer be the target. Instead, you will be the archer. But you will use arrows that I give you, arrows that will hit the mark every time and bring life rather than death to whomever they hit. You will shoot straight and sure, not by natural ability, but by the supernatural ability I give you, so that you will never miss what you are aiming at. Turning from Mr. John, I stood face to face with the likeness of myself, and I saw for the first time in my life something good inside of me. I saw a girl who had been trying to be so many other people, trying to imitate the abilities that got others noticed. I saw that she had buried who she really was and had been too scared to let her true self shine. A smile grew across my face as I read the words that had taken the places of those wretched arrows. Blessed, beautiful, gifted, powerful, precious, beloved, fully equipped, heir. The words echoed through my mind. Could these really be true? Am I really all those things? I didn't feel like what they described. I still felt like the same old me. My heart quickened and my eyes filled with tears as I came across the word royalty written over where that awful poison dart had pierced my heart. Oh, if it could only be true. I didn't know exactly what it meant, but I sure liked the sound of it. I replayed the word over and over in my mind, hoping with all of my heart that it was true, but fully expecting it to disappear and another word take its place. How in the world could royalty and Josephine Ann Smith go together in the same sentence without the word not along with them? The vision of the arrowless figure was burning a permanent image in my mind. I desperately tried to remember every detail so that when things got tough for me, I could look back to this very moment and remember how I was transformed. I never wanted to forget this day, even if it turned out to be a dream. Never. As I reached out to touch the display, Mr. John said that it was time to move forward. But I don't have the key. The inscription said there had to be a key, I replied. The key is found when the wounds of your past are healed. Only then will you be able to see the light that has always been right there in front of you. You can now move from the darkness of your past into the light of your future. Mr. John responded as he took my hand and showed me a small ray of light coming from a door directly behind where the figure stood. Are you ready to go forward? Will you be with me? I asked, secretly praying that I wouldn't have to be alone anymore. Always, he reassured.